Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. Very often I refer to the music that I'm listening to during any given period of time in the year, a musical ecosystem. And so what you're seeing here with Tier 5 is my musical ecosystem from this last summer when I was on vacation, whenever I was taking the kids to camps, when I was working from home. These things lay in the background both to engage and also to enrich my experience. Each one of these albums brings something along with it that contributes to an ecosystem that's already been in place. So the question is, what do these things bring? Well, here's the first 6 answers. First up, I got the Lemon Twigs, Look for Your Mind. Look for Your Mind, in my perception, kind of arrives carrying tradition, because the Lemon Twigs might be the closest thing we have to the true airs of late 60s pop production. A lot of bands borrow from the sounds of that era, but I don't think there's nearly as many that really understand the deeper mechanics of that music. The layered vocals and the harmonic movement in these songs keeps unfolding to new sections without ever really losing their momentum, which to me implies that this is music that's made by musicians that are really fluent in the language. Listening to this album, I really get a lot of Brian Wilson out of it. And again, it's not because they're necessarily copying Brian Wilson directly, but because they share the same fascination with songcraft as a creative act. Every arrangement is carefully considered, every melodic turn feels earned, and the songs, despite being packed with ideas, rarely feel cluttered. What really made this album interesting to me is the question that it raised for me, because a couple of years ago, their album Everything Harmony was a top 5 favorite of mine, and that particular album seemed to balance 60s nostalgia, that style of music, with more contemporary 90s and beyond styles of power pop. It kind of felt like a conversation between those two eras. I think that Look for Your Mind leans a lot more heavily into the source material. There are moments that feel so immersed in the language of pet sounds that they feel like they could just break right down to God only knows at any second. And that kind of made me think about the line that exists between continuation and preservation. But the more I listen to this album, the less that started to feel like a criticism, and more it just feels like what the Lemon Twigs are bringing to the table. Because the lowdown with this album is that it shows that craftsmanship really still matters. Great songs still matter. Beautiful harmonies still matter. The Lemon Twigs have such a complete command of this vocabulary that even when I found myself questioning whether they were really contributing anything to the tradition at all, I still found myself enjoying the results. So whether you get out of this album preservation, continuation, or somewhere in between, it's hard not to be impressed by just how beautifully this album carries the tradition forward.
Sadly, time again I play the fool, but I wish you still had today. It feels so good to say that I just can't get over losing you.
Next I got Spencer Cullum. Spencer Cullum's Coin Collection Volume 3. What I think that the Coin Collection Volume 3 brings is a sense of place, because even though Spencer Cullum is an instrumental specialist, he's not trying to showcase an instrument, he's trying to build a world. Now, Spencer Cullum is best known as a pedal steel player and a sideman for some very high-profile artists, Dolly Parton, Miranda Lambert, Angela Olsen, and Keisha. Given that resume, you'd think that he'd be calling on those folks to really bring some visibility to this album. But instead, Coin Collection 3 feels remarkably modest. It was recorded abroad and ultimately mixed and produced in Spencer Cullum's back shed. And the album has a feel of a personal project that somehow slipped out into the real world. This album has a lot of collaborators on it, but even the selection of those collaborators kind of tells a story about the album. Rather than assembling a cast of celebrity guests, Spencer seems to have chosen specific musicians that could bring a particular color or feel to a song. The result feels a little bit less like a showcase and more like a community of people that he's surrounded around himself for the purpose of making this album speak. Now, even though it has a folky roots, what I kind of got out of this album, it has a gently psychedelic feel to it. On first listen, the songs can seem simple, maybe even familiar, but close listening reveals a huge amount of unexpected details. Small textures emerge from the corners and arrangements drift off into unusual corners and then return. At times I felt myself thinking about early Pink Floyd, pre-Dark Side of the Moon, like More era, when the band was trying to feel out their own identity, but still connected to a sense of groundedness and almost folk sensibility. The album's deeper magic, though, I think, is the way that it blends landscapes. There's an unmistakable undertone of English folklore to this album, but it's expressed through the blues and country-ish feels of the American Southwest. The result seems familiar and maybe slightly displaced, like, two traditions surrounding a campfire. And beneath that warmth, I think there's something a little bit more intentional at work. Cullum himself has described the album as a response to the increasingly vitriolic tone of contemporary life. You can hear that in the album's generosity, but also in its mythology. The folklore elements aren't merely decorative. They occasionally feel like old stories summoned back into service, ancient archetypes standing watch against the current darkness. But it never turns this vision to any sort of manifesto. It still feels welcoming, humbling, and deeply musical throughout. This album has, to a degree, a sense of stewardship, not for the purpose of preservation for its own sake, but caring for traditions and stories. It's the sound of a gifted sideman stepping into the spotlight, but realizing that leadership doesn't require you to become somebody else.
These roots be the curse of us, 'cause they crumble down right into dust. I thought I was safe and I truly believed, 'cause I waged my war on a rowan tree. Rowan tree, stop my heart and bring me peace.
Next up I got the Clerkin trio, Somewhere Good. Somewhere Good, in my mind, arrives carrying atmosphere. And I think the way into listening to this album is not just listening to the notes, but listening to all the space that it opens up. The Clerkin trio is a Bristol-based three-piece group that kind of exists somewhere between jazz and bedroom pop, ambient experimentalism, and the lingering presence of trip hop. What really strikes me about Somewhere Good is how little interest it seems to have in announcing it's associated with any of those particular styles. The music rarely presents itself as jazz or pop or any of those things. Instead, it quietly builds environments that invite you to spend time in them. A lot of this album unfolds through meditative ostinatos and gently shifting textures. There are some vocals in this album, but there's also some long instrumental passages that really pay homage to the jazz tradition of listening and interaction. What's unusual about this album is how difficult it is to tease out what person is doing what. Acoustic and electronic sounds seem to interweave in such a way that the identities between the two really practically disappear, which encouraged me to stop listening for individual musicians and focus more on the collective atmospheres. As I listened, I kept visualizing these autumnal urban landscapes, not busy streets or a nightlife, but quieter moments. Side streets and empty transit platforms and rainy days with light reflecting off of wet pavement. The album often feels less like a collection of songs and more like a series of sketches that recall these sorts of places. What keeps it from becoming purely ambient, though, is its subtle sense of play. The music never seems burdened by its own seriousness. Instead, it wanders and explores, and it seems happy just to kind of follow an idea to see where it leads. So in a musical landscape that often asks for immediacy and clarity, Somewhere Good asks something a little bit different. It asks you to slow down and reflect on your surroundings and spend a little more time somewhere between a song, a sketch, and a place. Next up I got the West Virginia Snake Handlers revival, They Shall Take Up Serpents. Now this album, to me, to the ecosystem, brings a sense of conviction. Because let's be real, this is really pretty far out of my normal music listening. When I first heard about this live album that was recorded in a snake handling church in West Virginia, I became oddly obsessed with it. And part of that comes because I live in Appalachia now, and I've never seen anything like this, but in some ways I kind of see how I could. And I also grew up around ecstatic forms of Christianity myself. Now, we, of course, never gotten anything like handling snakes, but there was some speaking in tongues involved. So while I certainly don't ascribe to this congregation's beliefs, I recognize the impulse to embody faith rather than just talk about it. But the trick about listening to this album is to stop trying to listen for the snakes and listen for that conviction. Because really, ironically, the snakes play a relatively small role in the recording itself. There's really not a point at which they say, here's the snakes. I mean, there's one song in here called Taking Up Serpents, but it's also one of the more sedate and blues-influenced songs. But beyond that mention, you probably wouldn't know that the snakes were even there at all. With the understanding that they could emerge at any moment, this 20-minute recording has an underlying sense of menace that drapes over it. The possibility is always present, even if the snakes aren't always. But what's really most surprising is really not the snake handling. It's much I actually really like this album. There are moments of terrifying intensity in this album where the preacher and the music lock into this trance-like repetition. Other passages lean into the blues and spiritual traditions in a way that connects with the earliest currents of American vernacular music. The electric guitar and drums draw a straight line back to those traditions, while the preachers improvise with a freedom that feels more like improvised musicians than scripted speakers. And despite the weight of the subject matter and the devotion with which they tackle it, there are some genuinely entertaining and funny moments. One of my favorite tracks on here refers to like Starbucks and ADHD medication and the dangers of television addiction. And these things remind you that these aren't mythic figures. These are just people trying to find their way. One of my viewers even suggested this might be like some sort of Blair Witch style hoax. And while I can see why they might come to that conclusion, you can dig through some YouTube footage and find that this is an actual real thing. Admittedly, many of those are news stories that reduce the church to its most sensational practice, but this album doesn't really do that. Instead, it asks you to listen for everything else that's happening in the room. I did hear some passages in here where there's some studio trickery going on, which kind of challenges its status as a live album, but it never changed the feeling that I was listening to something genuine. So whether you find this album inspiring or unsettling or just completely foreign, it leaves you with one simple realization, is that conviction has a sound. The snakes may be what draw your attention, but I don't think it's what really gives this album its power. That comes from listening past the spectacle and hearing a community whose faith is expressed, not just in what they believe, but how they sing, play, and...
It's alright, it's alright, it's alright, alright, alright. Jesus said it, so it's alright. Taking up serpents, well, it's alright. Taking up serpents, yeah, it's alright. Jesus said it, so it's alright. Alright, alright. Alright.
Next I got Twelfth Night's Fact and Fiction. Twelfth Night brings, I think, to this ecosystem a real clear idea about identity. Because for me personally, as a person that's listened to Marillion for decades, this album has sort of been on the back burner for me for quite a while. And it's not because Twelfth Night really sounds like Marillion, but because they seem to be occupying a very similar creative moment at the same time. Jeff Mann, who is the original lead singer and lead singer on this album, occupies a lot of the same emotional territory that Fish would soon come to be known for. He's literate, he's theatrical, he's introspective, and he's completely committed to the emotional content of the songs. So it didn't make me think it was so much one band following the other. It just made me wonder how two bands could kind of come to the same artistic conclusion at the same time, especially at a time when progressive rock was barely starting to get a new foothold. That story is kind of built into the album itself, because Twelfth Night originally conceived of this album as, that balanced concise, shorter tunes with some longer progressive pieces, but as the recording progressed, they kind of decided to lean more into a more authentic voice for themselves and make it more of an identifiably progressive rock album. The opening was reimagined, and songs were rewritten, and the album gradually transformed from a compromise into a real statement of identity. One of the most revealing moments is the interaction between the song Creep Show and Love Song, because with the crafted, intentional intensity of Creep Show, the band really wanted to follow up with something that was a little bit more hopeful. And as a result, this song isn't just a strong track to follow Creep Show, it kind of completes the emotional architecture of the record. It's also the song that kind of makes me imagine an alternate history in which this song, Love Song, kind of becomes Twelfth Night's Kaylee, a song that carried them from cult heroes into being recognized by a much broader audience. It also reminded me that the early 1980s were filled with bands searching for a similar emotional sincerity. Whether it was Marillion or bands like The Cure that were exploring a darker but unusually vulnerable emotional place. There's a shared artistic environment that seems remarkably fertile in hindsight. At the same time, Fact and Fiction makes me realize why history unfolded the way that it did. Because although Jeff Mann does, have an extraordinary presence that maps generally over to Marillion also had Steve Rothery, whose lyrical guitar work served as a counterbalance to Fish's theatrical charisma. Twelfth Night occasionally lacks that same instrumental depth, and that makes some of the band's more abrasive passages feel kind of intersectionally unsettled. These rougher edges don't necessarily diminish the album, but it makes it seem like a different answer to the same question that Marillion was answering. More than anything, Fact and Fiction remind me that musical moments are rarely created by one band. They're built by artists discovering, usually separate from each other, that it's time to say something new. So because of that, Twelfth Night doesn't just introduce me to another excellent progressive rock band. It helps me to see the shape of neo-progressive rock a little bit clearer. And finally, I've got Squarepusher's Kammerkonzert. I would say this album brings a lot of different elements to the table, but one of them is really a sense of possibility. And I think the way in is not just to listen to songs, but for listening to sounds and ideas in motion. And this sense of motion led me almost immediately to comparisons to the orchestral music of Frank Zappa, because this particular album, although Squarepusher is known for hyperactive breakbeat EDM, this album is very orchestral in its scope. In some ways, it's kind of like Zappa without his very unique and distinctive melodic sensibilities. But what the two share is a certain jagged, frantic energy. The music is constantly turning corners, and once you feel like it's settled into one idea, then another arrives, then another, and then another. So listening to Kammerkonzert, I find myself questioning, what if Frank Zappa was still around today and had access to the sounds that are available through modern sequencing and modern sampling? And that's not necessarily because this album sounds like Zappa, but it evokes the same sense of compositional restlessness. The same way that Frank Zappa is less interested in establishing a groove than he is by opening up musical possibilities. Every section seems to generate a new idea, and every idea feels like it's pushing against the idea that came before it. And what fascinated me the most about this album, I think, and this is similar to Frank Zappa's synclavier work, is the tension between human imagination and mechanical execution. The sequencing allows for a level of precision and density that's difficult for human beings to execute. Yet the music doesn't ever feel clinical or overly synthetic. It feels like overloaded and bustling information, almost as if it's impatient with itself. So I feel like this album, again, brings a sense of possibility, because even where I wasn't sure where Kammerkonzert was headed, I always had the feeling it was discovering something along the way. And that's all I got for you guys this time around. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe and share it out with your friends. Also, follow me over on Spotify. I've got a growing playlist that includes everything from last season and everything that's from Tier 5 going forward. So please go check that out. Also, if you want to be part of the panel that helps to decide the Viewer's Choice Top 20 for the end of the year, please sign up for my Patreon below. Until you see you guys next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.